Hey folks, Matt Easton here, scholagladiatoria, and I'm at the Wallace Collection again with Dr. Tobias Capwell and Augusto, who I'll talk to more in a separate video and I'll introduce you properly to him. But we're here looking at the two famous, the most famous Pollaxes in the Wallace Collection's collection. Shall we just have a little look at those? So this one is probably earlier. Think.
Well, yeah, the general idea was that this of the two is the earlier one. Now, it looks like it's got more, patina age on it, but I think you'd be kind of hard pressed to really nail yourself down on what makes it definitely earlier. It's simpler. It doesn't have any decoration. Sure, it looks like things that are in French manuscripts around 1400, 1440-ish. So I think there's a case to be made for it.
I mean, I think what I would say about it is it's a style that appears earlier than the other one we're going to look at. So it could be earlier, but that style stays around until probably into the early 16th century, doesn't it? So it's got a very wide date range, whereas the other one is easier to narrow down, I think, to a period.
So the other one...
Have this poleaxe. There we go.
Fair enough. The other one is got some decoration on it and some writing on it, and sort of Gothic-y decoration, which starts to suggest a more second half of the 15th century sort of date. But again, one would like to look much closer at depictions and be able to nail down, okay, when do you start getting this kind of head profile? But certainly this kind of cutout decoration and just the sort of visual complexity of the thing suggests later rather than earlier.
So if I bring this closer to the camera, let's look at some of the features that kind of this is. I'll just touch the screen there so it focuses on the axe. So some of the characteristic things here that you'll notice about this is the straight edge, which is very, they're not all like that, and you get some which are tilted forward, don't you? So they're not all in line with the shaft. Some are tilted forward because, of course, if you're striking something with a long pole, that's often the angle it will make contact is actually at this angle rather than at that angle. A point which pretty much all poleaxes have usually a square section pole. Some of them have a little spear-shaped tip at the end, don't they, rather than the square. But this is essentially almost like a rondel dagger. And then the hammer at the back, which has a nice brass or latten, shall we say, inlay down the centre, is like a meat tenderizer, basically, isn't it? And so my interpretation of that is that it's to bite into armour if you're hitting someone, so it's not going to slide off quite so easily. And then it's got languettes which come all the way down to a handguard. I assume the handguard's original, certainly looks it, and we see it in art, don't we, of the period?
Yeah, I mean the whole question of the originality of the shafts or the hafts is a tricky one. But the metalwork all seems to be of a similar age and patina and everything to the rest of it. So the wood, I'm not so sure, but if it is newer, it's been done really well. It's not out of the question that really good rehafting could have been done in the 18th or 19th centuries. But it's certainly appropriate to what should be there.
Definitely, yeah, and it's interesting to me that the languettes go around the four sides. So, sometimes people in HEMA particularly obsess about flattened edge and this type of stuff, or if you're talking about a poleaxe, it does also have a flat and an edge. You would class this as the flat and this is the edge. And notice that it's got spikes, so this will be a bolt, essentially, won't it? And one of these will be a nut. Or at least in Talhofer's manual, that's how it shows they go together. So one of these is probably screwed, it might be peened, I suppose, and there'll be a shaft going through here which holds the head, which is this axe blade going through to the hammer, which goes through here, and then you have a kind of loop of steel which goes over the top, and then the bolt goes through. So it's quite a good, solid construction. But it's interesting to me that you have the languettes coming down all four sides, because of course the amount of force generated with poleaxes, not just hitting someone, but parrying or defending yourself with on. And of course, actually, when you succeed in hitting someone in armour, if you hit someone in the breastplate or the helmet, you're going to transfer a hell of a lot of force and energy to their body. And so this is going to be where it's going to break, isn't it, generally speaking? Any tool, and it's not always people I think often think about this as protecting from sword cuts or being lopped off. I think that's almost a secondary consideration, and the main one is making sure that this stays attached to this. So Augusto is nodding.
Yes.
You agree? Yeah.
That's an interesting point of comparison between the two, because this has the typical cheeks or langettes on all four sides of a square section haft, in this case, incidentally, whereas this one is the haft for the first foot at least below the head is completely sheathed in steel. The langettes butt up really nicely together. They seam together really nicely there. They're all attached in with flush rivets, so it's really smooth, but basically solid sheathing in steel down. It's
like a box on that, isn't it? Where there's like inlaid strips on this one. And the langettes, if anybody's looking at replicas or making these, the langettes in these are set into recesses in the wood, so they actually sit completely flush with the wood. They don't sit on top of the wood. I've seen a lot of replicas where the langettes just sit on top of the shaft. It's interesting, I think, ergonomically, that makes it far nicer to handle. And remember that even if you're wearing full armour and you've got gauntlets on, you've still got leather on the inside, and you still want to be able to handle and manipulate the weapon. And I find it interesting that you've got these ornate studs or rivets of some sort. I guess they look more like nails actually, because they're not in line with each other going through. Yeah, nails going in, and they're decorated, and that all gives extra kind of friction potentially if you're for some reason holding up at this end of the shaft, which you might be doing if you're using, making sure I don't hit anything else, if you're using this end. And that's the important thing to note, of course, is that poleaxes are double-ended weapons, and in all the treatises which describe and show their use, they're very much described as using both ends. Although this is the primary end, the back end is very important as well. If we look at Le Jeu de la Hache, for example, a Burgundian poleaxe fighting source, they stick the queue, or the tail, out forwards most of the time, so the head is kept back, ready to hit, and the tail is actually kind of used like a spear. So you'll use the back end like a spear, and then basically reel out the back end from essentially posta di donna or vom tag, kind of with a great big strike when you need to. So should we just look at this one briefly? I'll hand that one to Augusto. So this is a very different one. As I mentioned, I think this is a style that probably appears earlier. I would say probably late 14th century actually these appear, don't they? And it's interesting as well, when do poleaxes appear? Well, in a way you can kind of find things in 13th century art which look a bit like proto-poleaxes.
But first, the first depiction of like a proper poleaxe, so like with the axe head, a point, and then a hammerhead is 1362, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah,
in
that sounds.
France, I think.
Yeah,
it's like the first like clear depiction, and there's other like axe head and spike only like on the back and no spike on the top.
And once they appear, they become common, don't they? And it's a little bit like longswords. It's like, yeah, there are some longswords in 13th century art, but they appear in second half of the 14th century, and once they appear, they're suddenly everywhere. And it seems to tie in with the full plate harness, probably, or there's some kind of evolution of weapons, the rondel dagger, the poleaxe, the longsword, that seem to all come about at the same time, and these are what's featured in the treatises that we work from. But this is a different design. This is obviously a more traditional. I mean, this style of axe blade goes all the way back to well, you could say it's got its roots in the sort of Viking era, couldn't you? I mean,
and that's an interesting point. As in the history of elite armored warriors using two-handed axes. I mean, the Vikings, Anglo-Saxons,
the Housecarls,
the Housecarls with their big, or the Dane axes or whatever. I mean, it's an ancient tradition and association, and the question then is when does the old variety of two-handed warrior axe become what we can consider a knightly poleaxe? They are different things, but they're part of the same ethos and the tradition.
Absolutely, and when we look at the use of them, actually the techniques which are given for using poleaxes are very similar to Manciolino's techniques for the bill, for example. So he uses both ends, he uses similar guard positions. He's really only got 2 guard positions as far as I remember. And if anybody's wanting to reconstruct kind of Dark Age large axe use, of the 10th, 11th century, then I'd say look at poleaxe sources, because fundamentally the kind of positions and the kind of ways that they're going to be used are probably not that dissimilar. Yeah, a Dane axe is a bit shorter, but obviously we don't know how long these were originally, but when you look in art, poleaxes seem to vary, don't they, from anything from about 5 foot to above 6 foot.
Yeah.
So they're not
a lot are shorter than you might expect. I mean, when you're looking at a modern axe in a museum where the haft may be newer, they've inferred the length, and you get axes of both head types illustrated in 15th century art a lot, where the head's at sort of shoulder level. They're quite short little nippy things that make sense if you're in a press of battle and you don't have lots of room to be messing around with a long staff weapon.
I think that, I can't remember which manuscript it is, but I think it's in your book, your English armour book. I think it's someone in a really typally English harness, and he's kind of leaning his arm on the top of a pollaxe, and so that kind of tells it tells you how, it's actually kind of longsword length, big longsword length. But yeah, so we've got a curved axe blade of a type that you can find going certainly back into the 13th, 12th century. But then this is a newer thing, isn't it? And again, this seems to tie in. It's a bit like the meat tenderizer hammer on there. It seems to come in the 14th century, this shape, and we find it not just on pollaxes but on numerous weapons. We find it on lance coronets, and war hammers, and later it goes on into lucerne hammers and indeed pollaxes and other things. So this seems to be, again, associated with plate armour, doesn't it? It seems to be something that comes about as or tied into plate armour.
As a jouster, I can't help looking at that and immediately thinking joust of peace.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.